All right. Okay, so what did we go over last week? Not the end of John, but the end of John chapter. That would have been quite an accomplishment. We went over the end of John chapter 12, right? And does anybody remember what was going on in John chapter 12? Right, that's actually what we're going into today. It is the end of the big public ministry of Christ, was the end of chapter 12, where he's talking to crowds, where he's talking to the Jewish leaders, where he's also talking to the greater body of disciples, right? That's all in chapter 12, and so this is going to be a narrowing of focus, right? We're going to put the spotlight on the disciples. And we talked about the fact that, he has gone through the triumphal entry. He's entered Jerusalem. And he's pointed to the fact that he is going to suffer and die. And that he is going to the Father, right? So there is all that is summed up in chapter 12. And so today we're going to go into John chapter 13, and it is an intimate, where it starts off this intimate supper with the disciples. So John chapter 13, verses 1 to 30. Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that this hour had come, that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper, and laying aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into the basin and began washing the disciples' feet to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. So he came to Simon Peter. He said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, What I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. Peter said to him, Never shall you wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I do not wash your feet, you have no part with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, He who has a bath needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. You are clean, but not all of you. For he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason he said, Not all of you are clean. So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table, again he said to them, Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and teacher, wash your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you should also do as I did to you. Dallas asked me what version I was reading from, and it wasn't the ESV. And this is the NASB, and it's a little bit clunkier because its translation is tends to be a little bit more literal, right? So it's a little bit more awkward in the way that it puts things. Some passages, most of the time you don't notice it, but sometimes it's really noticeable. Okay, so we're going to stop there. That's at verse 15, and we're going to start out. Okay, so we're getting in after the triumphal entry. There is, as we've talked about, John's account of Christ's ministry is very different than the accounts given in the synoptics. And after the triumphal entry in the synoptics, What are the synoptics? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And why are they called synoptics? What does synoptic mean? They're all similar. Same eye. Think about it like this. Same eye. It's the same point of view, the same perspective. So they have very tight similarities, and John is quite different than the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John excludes from his account after the triumphal entry a lot of the things that are included in the synoptics, like the second cleansing of the temple, right? You remember in John, at the start of Christ's ministry, he cleanses the temple, and then he cleanses the temple again at the end of his ministry, as recorded in the synoptics. The synoptics give the description of what goes on with the fig tree, right? Where Christ commands the fig tree to be withered because it doesn't have any fruit on it. It also has all sorts of other teachings in the synoptics that aren't included in John, and especially teachings on eschatology. What is eschatology? End time stuff, right? So John excludes all the stuff on eschatology. None of that is in John's gospel. John, as we've mentioned several times before, he alludes to the other gospels, right? He will give you points of reference that let you know where his material fits into the synoptics, but it is additional information for another purpose, right? So he is giving you extra information about the ministry of Christ for his own purposes, because he wants to emphasize something different than the synoptics. He wants to flesh out the synoptics. And we would assume, right, and I think this is a fairly safe assumption, that he is writing well after the synoptics are in circulation. That the people who are his audience already are well familiar with the synoptics, and so he can give this information. What is an obvious reason why he wouldn't spend a lot of time in eschatology in his gospel? Right, because he writes the book of Revelation, right? So he is going to have a much more extensive coverage of eschatology later on. He may or may not know this at the time of this writing. Okay, so that's where we are. That's where he's starting. And right off the bat, we're presented with a bit of a problem in John. And John doesn't have any trouble giving us these difficulties. And obviously the Holy Spirit through John. So it says, now before the feast of Passover. What is our problem here? So given that chapter 13 is about an intimate supper that occurs immediately before the crucifixion, what would be the problem? The problem is whether this is the same supper as the Last Supper, or whether it is a different supper from the Last Supper. Because nowhere in this supper is there any mention of the institution of the Lord's Supper. None. He doesn't mention it at all. Doesn't even allude to it. Right? There is no bread. There is no wine mentioned. Nothing. Right? There's the problem of time in relationship to the crucifixion. Because there is, even in the synoptics, there's the problem of if Christ is the Lamb of God, the Passover lamb sacrificed, is he sacrificed on Thursday or is he sacrificed on Friday? Because if he's sacrificed on Thursday and the Passover lamb is killed on Friday, then how can he be the Passover lamb sacrificed but celebrate Passover on a Thursday. See the problem? Because they're, what tradition though?
Because they had, I was reading on this when I was at work this past time, and specifically the volume of lambs that had to be killed a lot of time, there wasn't physically enough time, so they, in Jewish tradition, that I think it was the Galileans and northern people were kind of further. They would do that, have start their Passover on a Thursday, I believe, and then others it would continue on to Friday because of the sheer volume at that time of people coming to Jerusalem. They couldn't physically perform the sacrifices, and they needed a lot of time according to traditional laid out. The Bible said to spread it over 2 days.
Yeah, that certainly is a practical consideration for the Jews at the time. Some of the other things that you need to, that make you wonder about this feast is whether this is the same supper or a different supper, is that the disciples think he has sent Judas, he will say later on, he sent Judas to buy things for the feast. Right? And then in chapter 18 at the crucifixion, the Jews are not wanting to go into Pilate because they don't want to pollute themselves or defile themselves so that they can still eat the Passover. Right? Those are things that make you think that it's a different supper. But as has been pointed out, there were practical considerations. There's also a timeline difference. Oh, we're ringing. Okay, so there is a consideration of how you reckon time. Whether you reckon time from sunup to sunup, or whether you reckoned it from sundown to sundown. And it has been put forward that there is this idea amongst the Pharisees, right, that it is from sunup till sunup. And amongst the Sadducees and the elites, it was from sundown to sundown. So basically, it was a shift so that the Pharisees and many of the northern people, as was pointed out, would celebrate the Passover in the first timeline, and the Sadducees, the priests, the elites, would use the second timeline, which would put them sundown to sundown and would shift them over so that they would celebrate the Passover on the Friday. Right? What we would then... So both of them would be celebrating it sort of on the same day, but not on the same day. You understand what I'm saying? How that works? And so this also would go along with John's Gospel lie, based on what we've looked at before. John is writing from what perspective? The Pharisee perspective or the Sadducee perspective? Who is his story? The Sadducees, right? The priests, the elites. That's why he focuses in on the feasts and everything, is because he's speaking to that kind of audience. And so he has that kind of audience in mind. So you see a lot in John that there's this separation between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and how they deal with Christ. So in that respect, we have a solution to the harmonization of the Gospels, that indeed this can be the same supper. And not only that, we see that John includes the identification of Judas as the betrayer, and it is an almost identical account to the synoptics. So the way in which Judas is identified as the betrayer by Christ at the prompting of the disciples is almost identical in the synoptics and in John. So that would indicate that it didn't happen twice, that this was the same supper. Why do you think that John might not have bothered to include the institution of the Lord's Supper? It's already there, right? And it is, we can assume, I think safely also, that it has become an entrenched tradition in the Christian church that does not need to be reiterated, right? He doesn't need to go over that again. He has other information that he is going to impart to us. And so, he just, in passing, he says, before the feast. Now, if he says before the feast, would that automatically indicate that what they're eating is not the feast? No. There's a bit of a difference here in using the terminology, right? John is saying now before the feast of the Passover. If he's speaking to the priestly class, right, he's speaking in terms of what they would think. And the feast, remember, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread was a 7-day celebration. And so when they talk about the Passover, they talk about the 7-day celebration of the Passover. So all of what's going to come on after this point is, and that whole 7-day period is all included in that celebration. And so even if you're a priest, this would still be part of the Passover celebration, right? So it would be before they celebrated the Passover, the priestly class, the Sadducees, but it is still part of the Passover celebration. Capiche? Make sense? Okay, so we're going to move on. So, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper and laid aside his garments, taking a towel, he girded himself. All of that first section of that is all part and parcel of John's introduction to Jesus washing his feet, because he is making a very clear statement about Christ's particular perspective, his particular situation before he washes the feet. Right? And that is extremely important for us to take into account because of the humility of the action. Right? So, Jesus knows, and you have to break this down and think about this. Jesus knows that the time for his crucifixion has come. Right? So he has passed the test of a perfect life without flaw. He is the Passover lamb without spot or blemish. And not only that, but he has been approved by the Jewish leaders as the Passover lamb. Right? He has not yet gone through his trial where they admit his guiltlessness, but they have already said that he is the one who is to be sacrificed for the people of Israel. You remember? We already read that they had the Sanhedrin come together, and they have said, Caiaphas the high priest has said that he is the one that needs to die for the people. So he has already been approved as the sacrificial lamb for the people, and they will literally lay hands on him like the sacrificial lamb and then sacrifice him. They will literally do that. And he has come and he has lived a perfect life for his sheep, and he is about to demonstrate to the uttermost this love. No greater love hath any man than he laid down his life for his friends. And so he is going to lay down his life. So, as it says, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, and he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end, or to the uttermost. And not only that, so he knows he's fulfilled his task, and he has loved intensely his sheep. He also knows that Judas, on the prompting of Satan, Judas, who is his friend, Judas, who he has loved just like the other disciples, he has not treated him badly. He has treated him very well. He has warned him continuously. He has poured himself out for Judas. Judas is going to betray him. And this is not like a blindsided betrayal where you're surprised. This is Jesus knows Judas is going to betray him. He knows, and yet he has not treated him badly. He has been very kind to Judas, even though he knows what Judas is up to and what he's going to do. Right? So Jesus has loved his disciples. He knows that Judas is going to betray him. He is going to the cross, the most excruciating, the most unpleasant, the most horrible experience that anyone will ever experience. Yes, Mom?
Why does it say Satan entered into him at that point? Wasn't Satan always in him?
It says during supper, the devil having already in the past put into his heart. So Satan had prompted him up until this point, but at the supper, Satan actually enters into Judas. So that's the difference. Up until this point, he's always been dead in his trespasses and sin and under Satan's control, and Satan has prompted him to do this evil, right? But at this point, after the identification of Judas, Satan enters into Judas. So that's the difference. Okay, so he is going to lay down his life for his friends at the cross in this excruciating trial, and his friends are still arguing at the supper, as recorded in the Synoptics, who is going to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. They're still arguing about who has the preeminent role amongst the disciples. They are acting in a way that shows selfishness and self-interest, in spite of the fact that he is about to sacrifice himself for them. And it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God. So Jesus knows that he is not just the most important man in the room. He knows that he is the most important man that has ever been or will ever be. He is God in human flesh. He is worthy of all adoration and praise. He is worthy of everyone's servitude, right? That no one outranks him, and no one, the angels, fall down in front of him on a continuous basis and cry, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." That's the kind of worship, adoration, and respect that he is due. Right? And all of this, John is putting forth in front of you. So not only is he God and is due all the reverence and honor and respect that God is deserving of, but he's also the Messiah, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the King of Israel. He is the last Adam. He is the one to whom God has consecrated. And as that preeminent man, he deserves all honor and respect and glory. So on both sides of the equation, they should be worshiping him. And that is what John puts forward and then says, and now he strips down to his underwear. He strips down to his underwear, and he takes a pan of water, and he puts a towel around his waist, and he starts to wash feet. That's the picture John wants to give you. That Jesus, who is all of it, and who is going to go through terrible suffering, and who has been just betrayed, now dresses like a slave and starts to do the most disgusting job that you can do. That's the picture that he wants to give. And the lesson for us is that we have lots of excuses. Right? Now, we tend not to, and I think we went over this before, we tend not to have this attitude that we're high and mighty. Right? We don't have the tendency to have the attitude, and we pat ourselves on the back, oddly enough, and say, yeah, I am so humble because I don't think I'm better than anybody else. No. I'm not like that, right? I'm not like other people who think that. I am a servant. I am lowly. But we do make the excuses that you don't understand what I'm going through. The reason why I'm not going to help you out is because I've had a really bad day. Right? You don't understand what I'm about to go through. You don't understand how people have treated me. We tend to have a much more victim mentality than an emperor mentality. We tend to be proud. We tend to be selfish, but we justify it by having the victim mentality. I don't have to do anything for you because poor me. And you should be treating me well. You should be serving me because I've had it rough. Right? And we see Christ when John the Baptist is put to death and he goes out by himself into the wilderness to be alone and to pray, and the people all show up and go, hey, heal us. He doesn't say, you selfish people, don't you know what I've just been through? My cousin just died. Leave me alone, would you? Nope. He says, okay. And he has compassion on them and heals their sick. So, yeah, we don't tend to be, you don't know who I am. I am so important. I'm not helping you. You help me. We tend to be, oh, poor me. I've had it so rough. And so I can't possibly go and do that for you because, my kids are brats, and they've given me a hard time all day, and I just don't feel like it. Right? That's where we tend to be. But Christ is about to go to the cross and knows it. Right? He knows he's going to the cross. He knows that his friend has turned up his heel against him. And yet, he girds himself like a slave. And in his underwear, because that's what it says. It says he took off his garments. Not just his outer garment, but also his other garments, so that he's dressed like a slave, and he starts to wash their feet. And they are shocked and embarrassed. Right? Okay, so we got a few minutes. We'll start on the next part. Okay, here we go. So, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. So he came to Simon Peter and he said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, What I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. Peter said to him, Never shall you wash my feet. Jesus answered him and said, If I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Okay, one of the things that I realized, I thought about when I was reading this, was you have Jesus, and all the disciples are shocked at what he's doing, and he approaches Peter, and Peter, in typical fashion, blurts out, wait a second, you're not going to wash my feet. what is absent from what Peter says that's kind of surprising? Let's put it to you like this, and you can pick it up easier. When Jesus comes to John the Baptist for baptism, right? And he comes to John, and he says, and he comes to him for baptism. What does John say? Not simply that he's not worthy, but something else. Right. I shouldn't be baptizing you. You should be baptizing me. Right? What's absent from what Peter says? Right. Peter don't jump up and say, wait a second, Lord, I'll wash the feet. He don't say that. He just goes, no way, you're not washing my feet. Right? Let's say, yeah. John, get over here. Yeah, he doesn't jump up. He realizes that there's a serious problem with Jesus washing his feet, but he isn't about to wash anybody else's feet, right? And I thought that was kind of humorous that there is that absence of volunteering for the task. And so he comes to Peter and, well, actually, I don't think I want to get into that because there's some big implications of the foot washing that need to be unpacked, I'll say. I don't like that term, but unpacked. We need to unpack that because we get lost in the humility, and there's more to it than just the humility. The humility is a huge part of it, obviously, but there's more to it than that. So we're going to end off there. Thanks.